Schiit Audio's new Mjolnir headphone amp, if you listen closely to the chassis, it actually hums. So let's check it out.
Them that's God shall get, and them that's not shall lose. So the Bible says, but it still is news. Your mama made
Schiit Audio's Mjolnir has always been something of an odd amp. The very first one introduced Schiit Audio's Circlotron technology before they introduced the Ragnarok headphone and speaker amp. And that amp was only balanced output. There were no single-ended outputs because it was early in their development. The second amp was a tube hybrid, which you could replace the tubes with solid-state versions to make it a solid-state amp. And the third one, yet again, is completely different. In this case, it's a 2-watt pure Class A headphone amplifier. And you think, well, 2 watts isn't that much. Well, if you think about it, actually most headphone amplifiers that say they have 5, 6, 7 or whatever watts are actually Class AB. They're not Class A at all. Class A uses a lot of power. In fact, it has all the power available constantly. So this has the 2 watts always available at full power at any moment. Most headphone amps actually only run, a few hundred milliwatts to about 1 watt in Class A before they drift into Class AB. At worst, some manufacturers advertise their amplifiers as having so many watts of output, but that's only an instantaneous peak power and actually way above what they're capable of doing without extreme distortion. This is always 2 watts, and that 2 watts actually uses a lot of power such that the heat sinks on it come from Schiit Audio's speaker amps. And the chassis, now that it's been on an hour or so, it gets quite warm, enough to act as a very good hand warmer now that the temperature here has dropped considerably. And the heat sinks get hot enough that I can't leave my hands on them at all. So that's not something for people who are worried about ventilation or want to cram them in a tight rack. It's something you really have to put in a well-ventilated area, such as I have on top of my Yggdrasil. But the advantage you get with Class A is you get pure performance. And inside there you have 32 10 amp rated output devices. So you have a big, old school 2 watt amp. It's something more akin to what you might drive very sensitive speakers with, let alone headphones. And it's probably appropriate that I got out the good old Susvaras again to have a listen, and it drives them very easily. But like all Schiit Audio products, there's always something a little bit unique, not just the fact that they use chokes for the input, but the fact that you can actually change the kind of amplification circuit. Now, it has one kind of amplification circuit, and in the choices that Jason Stoddard had in how to implement it, there were a couple of options he had available. Now, these options are going to sound a little bit odd because they sound like other terms in audio. One of them was single-ended or push-pull. Now, single-ended doesn't refer to the single-ended output. It refers to the way the transistors are set up inside the amplifier and how they operate. So you can actually switch between those two modes in the middle here. Push-pull potentially gives more power and maybe possibly more distortion. You can actually check out Schiit Audio's own measurements of the amp running low impedance and high impedance headphones in the different modes to see what effect they have. But one of the other cool things he has made available is that you can actually engage or disengage some negative feedback. And I'll talk about my impressions of using both of those switches in the sound impressions shortly. Now, in terms of design, otherwise you have obviously high and low gain, you have an input selector. Unfortunately, there's only one balanced input and one single-ended input. I really wish this amp had more inputs, as it would have been perfect for me, since I like to use amps to compare different DACs and different sources. But alas, it is what it is. One useful thing you can do though is it does have preamp outputs, which are switchable. So that means if you do have, say, active speakers, or you want to use it as a preamp with a power amp, you can readily do so and switch it in and out without having to worry about whether your headphones are plugged in or not, and your headphones will be on all the time. In this review, I'm not going to go into super detail about the performance as a preamp. Generally speaking, performance as a preamp is much the same in my experience as the performance with a device as a headphone amplifier. So take what I say in my impressions as a headphone amplifier as meaning much the same thing as a preamp, and I have used it with my power amp as a kind of preamp when I've just wanted to not have to unhook and rehook things together and just have this outputting directly to my power amp and use it as a volume control for that. Sonically, the performance of the Mjolnir is, to put it simply, outstanding. The first words that came to mind when I thought of my impressions of the Mjolnir was that it's so resolving it becomes smooth, which sounds like an odd thing because we normally associate smoothness with maybe coloration or a lack of detail. But it was rather like, to use a kind of parallel, my experience with Chords Dave when I added the MScaler, where you expect resolution to be sharper, but actually it was smoother. So it brought a level of detail regardless of the headphones I used, which was simply put quite outstanding. Now, headphone drive is absolutely and very unquestionably excellent. They have none of the kind of issues that I may have complained about with previous headphone amps. I mean, it was a distinct step up, for example, from Schiit Audio's own Jotunheim, which I actually have one sitting right behind me. And never once did I ever think about the ability of the Mjolnir to drive headphones, including HiFiMan's very demanding Susvaras, which, even though I got the volume control, well, I think I was getting it up somewhere around the 1 to 2 o'clock mark in high gain, were the control and the consistency of the level of detail and soundstage and, well, everything in general was just frankly fantastic. Actually, the only thing I could find to beat the Mjolnir was using a speaker amp with the Susvaras to get even more performance. So as far as headphone amplifiers go, it's pretty much at the top there. Now, in terms of resolution, I thought, well, is this starting to feel more resolving than I'm used to with even other headphone amps, such as the Master 9 I've got sitting down here? So to test that, normally I go directly from Chord's TT2 and MScaler setup. And then usually when I use some kind of headphone amplifier, there's often a small loss of detail. And it was noticeable with the Master 9. It's slightly noticeable with the Studio 6 as well, of course, depending what tubes I have in there. And it seemed to be barely noticeable with the Mjolnir, which was pretty impressive. Now, one of the things I did initially was compare with my main amp, ALO Audio's Studio 6, and at the time I had some kind of warm sounding tubes in there because sometimes, a perfect accuracy is not what I feel like listening with. But those tubes made things sound very dull and unresolving relatively to the Mjolnir. So what I did is I swapped them out for some good Sylvania and GE tubes, and that brought the Studio 6 in line with Mjolnir in terms of absolute resolution, as far as I could hear the most fine micro details in the best music I had available, such as, for example, an album which you may have heard on this video, Carmen Gomes Sings the Blues. That's an album which I bought originally from Native DSD, and subsequent to that, and learning what they were doing with high-res music and making recordings which had very minimal processing and minimal mastering so that you got the most out of them, and also selling recordings from other studios that make very high-quality recordings, I asked them to become a sponsor for my videos. So in that, if you're after very high-quality recordings, with others I will feature hopefully in future videos, do check out Native DSD, and they don't just make music in DSD, but have also regular high-res music available. Anyhow, back onto the Mjolnir. One of the interesting things that came up, and I'm sure this will annoy some people when I mention it, is I was listening from the balanced and single-ended outputs of the TT2 into the Mjolnir. I was hoping to use the single-ended from the TT2 and use the balanced outputs of the TT2 into my speaker amp, Audio GD's Master 10. When I tried comparing the balanced and single-ended inputs, however, I felt that the single-ended inputs, the RCA inputs that is, didn't sound as good. Now, normally the TT2 is optimum from the single-ended output, so I was thinking, now what's going on here? And I noticed, of course, that I had actually a higher grade of interconnect on the balanced inputs compared to the interconnects on the single-ended inputs. Now, the difference between these interconnects, well, there's a significant price difference, obviously, but I'd never really noticed a difference between those interconnects before. So I wondered, is it the interconnects, or is it the fact that there's a difference between the XLR and RCA inputs? So in that, I removed the XLR higher grade interconnects and put the same model of interconnect on the XLR, and I still noticed a difference between the XLR and RCA inputs, and it wasn't a volume level difference, it was an actual difference in resolution, but it wasn't as much of a difference as before when I had the better interconnect on the XLR. And as I said, considering that I hadn't really noticed a difference between these very expensive interconnects and the moderately priced ones, I thought, well, that confirms that I am hearing more detail than I'm used to through most headphone amplifiers. Of course, I did compare it directly to the Master 9, and again, I felt that I was hearing more resolution than I'm used to, a lot more micro detail, but it was presented not kind of sharply and over-focused like you imagine higher levels of detail. As I said before, it felt like smoother. It was more natural, and like the fine details came through easily without sounding like they were over-sharpened. And that despite the amp not really having any kind of a particular sound signature, it didn't seem, for the most part, to be any really different to the sound from the TT2's outputs, although that the level of headphone drive with some more demanding headphones does end up making those headphones sound a touch warmer, as it's usually the bass frequencies where you notice the amount of drive of a particular headphone amp. If the drive is maybe relatively a little bit weak, then the bass frequencies seem to come through maybe a little bit weaker. Now, I didn't try comparing with the XLR outputs of the TT2 directly into headphones as, well, I just didn't. So I'll have to find my adapter and try that in the future, because the XLR outputs of the TT2 can even drive very sensitive speakers. I was more concerned with discerning whether I am hearing more detail than I previously did with other amplifiers. Now you're thinking, well, what about that Headamp GSX Mini that's sitting behind you? How does it compare to that? Well, that was an interesting comparison, as the GSX Mini is a very slightly warm sounding amp, and if you put it into low gain, it has a little bit of negative feedback as well, which I don't think sounds quite as good. And yes, I'll talk about the negative feedback in the Mjolnir shortly. Overall, comparing both of them with level matching them to within 0.1 dB, I felt that the Mjolnir was yet more detailed. There was a little bit of vagueness from the GSX Mini relative to the Mjolnir that told me it was a step down in terms of overall resolution. And considering it's more expensive, I'm a little bit sad about that. Probably what's more so, in terms of resolution, the Mjolnir in its price range is really outstanding. But now you want to know some of the fine details about, of course, the switches on the front. Now, of course, you have high and low gain, but the most interesting ones are the switch which switches between what's called single-ended mode and push-pull mode, and the negative feedback switch. Now, supposedly the push-pull mode can potentially allow more power through to the headphones, and there was a very slight sense of better dynamics through some headphones. Now, I did a thing which Jason will probably cringe at, which is plug in my Odyssey LCD-Rs in there, which are 2 ohm headphones and not really designed for this kind of amp, but they are extremely sensitive, and I wasn't about to try and play very bass-heavy music through them, which might send the amp into protection mode. That was where the switch made the most difference, and this is kind of a setup that you're not likely to encounter, as you can't buy LCD-Rs anymore unless you find one secondhand. But it kind of emphasized how you seem to get more current out of the amp and a little bit better dynamics in push-pull mode. Although most of the time with many headphones it didn't seem to make a very significant difference, it just felt very subtly, slightly more, I'd say, dynamic or slightly looser sounding and a little bit more entertaining. On the other hand, the negative feedback switch seems to tighten things up, and technically it should remove some of the distortion in the amp, so it does sound a little bit cleaner, a little bit tighter, but also a tad less interesting sounding. And it's very, very subtle, the difference between these modes, such that even if I was, say, switching between push-pull with negative feedback off and then flicking both switches at the same time to make it the tightest sounding it can be with negative feedback on and in single-ended mode, the difference was noticeable, but not really so much. I think that if I plugged headphones in and I didn't actually know what mode I was in at all, I wouldn't be able to guess. Actually, I'm absolutely sure I wouldn't be able to guess. But it is enough of a difference that it can make maybe just the subtle feeling of how the music sounds with certain particular headphones a little bit cleaner or a little bit more dynamic depending on how you set it up. In terms of system synergy, of course, I was using headphones such as I said, the HiFiMan Susvaras. We have my pair of Meze Elites. I bought a pair of Focal Utopias from a dealer that was no longer going to stock Focal and put them on sale. And that was a bargain I couldn't pass up. The Focal Utopia 2022s, and if I haven't already reviewed them, I will be reviewing them. They are the kind of headphones that reveal absolutely everything about your system. And it was very interesting how no matter whether I was using, you sometimes have particular synergies with certain amps or tubes or whatever, and certain headphones. The Utopias still are a fairly bright headphone, at least for me. But the absolute clarity of the Mjolnir made them a real joy pairing. With that excellent detail that the music has, I could hear very clearly through without any feeling of say, you know, harshness or edginess or distortion in that sense. Albeit something to note that I do have a lot of power conditioning and noise filtering in my system to avoid any harshness coming through. And I also, of course, have an excellent source in that case, or actually a number of excellent sources if you include Schiit Audio's Yggdrasil. It was very good also for revealing, say, for example, I've been listening to the Yggdrasil and playing around with digital upsampling, and maybe the Yggdrasil original, which is an OG model, which I have here, does sound maybe very slightly grainy in the vocals for me. And it was the Utopias and Mjolnir were very good for comparing that to when I was using some upsampling to the Yggdrasil instead. Likewise, headphones which have a good amount of bass, such as Final's D8000 Pro or D8000s, and of course the Meze Elites, it was very outstanding to have excellent levels of bass control so that you get the most out of the kind of dynamic punch that you get with some of these headphones. Likewise, some of my favorite headphones are Dan Clark Audio's Expanse, and they too are driven excellently from the Mjolnir. And again, like the Susvaras, the only way I could get better sound from them was literally to drive them from my Master 10 speaker amp, which I have to do by turning the volume right down, and also turn the volume right down from the TT2 to be able to play back through that method. So overall, that makes me feel the Mjolnir is the kind of amp that, with a kind of level of resolution that you'd normally pay $3,000 to $4,000 for, if not more. And that makes it a screaming bargain. And if you see me comment online when people said, when are you going to review the Mjolnir? I mean, this is my own amp. I've just been saying, go and buy one. Seriously, it is that good. Now, whether it's available in stock, they're making them in batches at the moment, and the availability may be a bit on or off. If you can get one of these amps, I highly recommend it. And this is, in case you're wondering, not anything I get any kind of kickback or affiliate link for. This is my own amp. I bought it, and I bought it purely on the specifications of how Jason Stoddard described it. Actually, interestingly, Jason does discuss in a video with Dan Clark from Dan Clark Audio about tuning devices and how he was trying to work out why the Mjolnir 3 sounds so good and what particular part of it contains the particular magic that works. And then the answer is actually the whole package as it is. So if you don't mind having an amp that actually gets quite warm, and especially now as the weather here where I am has gotten quite a bit colder, I don't mind it heating up my room, whereas in summertime it was, well, fighting against the air conditioning, then it is an outstanding amp. And it will definitely need some ventilation, of course, if you're going to be using it. It's not something you're going to cram in on a tight rack. So thanks to Native DSD, thank you to all my patrons, thank you to everyone who has been supporting me, and manufacturers, of course, who have lent me gear so I can evaluate their products as well as other products with their products. If you'd like to become a supporter, don't forget to check out the links in the description. There are different ways of doing that. If this video helped you in any way, maybe it helped you decide to buy something, or help you to decide even not to buy it, you can also leave a super thanks as well. That will be much appreciated, as it does give me more of an opportunity to make more of these videos. If you own a Mjolnir, please do also leave your impressions in the comments as well. My videos are designed to be helpful for people interested in buying a product, and comments from people, not just from myself, but actual owners, also help those people as well decide whether the product is suitable for them. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.
Yeah, the strong gets more while the weak ones fade, and empty pockets do don't ever make the grave, but your mama may have, and your papa has a